Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival, or as we like to call it, the VGBF. I am Phil Kaminsky, your VGBF host, and although we miss hosting you in person, we're so happy that you've chosen to spend your time with us virtually for this evening's watch party. Before we head into tonight's event, we would very much appreciate it if you would do three things for us. First, please like this video. Second, leave a comment below to let us know where you're watching us from. And third, hit the subscribe bell to get notifications about our latest and upcoming presentations. Also, we encourage you to support tonight's author by purchasing his book through independent bookseller and our partner, Politics and Prose. And very importantly, an extremely big thank you goes out to VGBF sponsors, the David and Mikel Blair Family Foundation, Downtown Crown, RPAI, and Montgomery College. Okay, let's get started. Tonight, we have with us George Zaidan, author of Ingredients, The Strange Chemistry of What We Put in Us and on Us. George, an MIT-trained chemist who co-hosted CNBC's hit show, Make Me a Millionaire Inventor, reveals what will kill you, what won't, and why, explained with high-octane hilarity, hysterical hijinks, and other things that don't begin with the letter H. George created National Geographic's web series Ingredients, and he co-wrote and directed MIT's web series Science Out Loud. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Forbes, the Boston Globe, National Geographic Magazine, NPR's The Salt, and many more. He is currently executive producer at the American Chemical Society. Interviewing George tonight is statistics professor and award-winning science communicator, Regina Nuzzo. Regina's writings on probability, statistics, data, and other topics have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Scientific American, ESPN Magazine, New Scientist, and Reader's Digest, amongst others. She has been invited across the world to speak to various audiences about how to not fool yourself or others with statistics. Welcome, George and Regina.
Hey.
For having us.
Okay, George, I think it's you and us, and me.
It's you and I.
So before we start, I Googled you and I found this random fact, okay, that you played Thomas Jefferson on TV at one time. True or false? Rumor? Fact.
That is 100% true. This was actually, so I worked on a food show on the Food Network called Good Eats, and it was hosted by Alton Brown. And my very first, and my job was a production assistant. It was nothing glamorous. I was, plunging toilets, making coffee, helping, like whatever needed to be done. But my very first day on the job, Alton looks at me and he goes, "Put that guy in a wig. We need a Thomas Jefferson." And it came at the end. I had one line, and it was
one,
and it was, "I declare these sprouts to be delicious." My one line came at the end of like a 3-minute monologue that Alton had to do. And I screwed it up like 3 or 4 times, and he got really upset, justifiably so. But yeah, that was my first day working on Good Eats. So I have to say, I'm glad that you Googled me, because I also Googled you, and I heard that you identify as a cyborg. Can you explain that a bit?
A cyborg, indeed. Now, you wouldn't know it by looking at me, right? I don't have the Jean-Luc Picard equipment. Yes, I'm a 5-year-old cyborg, actually. And my half-robot internal machine, it's internal. I have a tiny brain computer embedded in my skull that's zapping my brain with electricity thousands of times per second. And that is the only way that I hear. Which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's total modern medicine. And so I get a little bit of equipment, but yes, a cyborg.
That's very cool.
Okay, so the book.
The book.
We should talk about the book. First of all, huge fan of the book.
Thank
I have
you.
it right
Thank you.
here.
Thank you.
Loved it. Good. I'm glad you have your own. Loved it. Okay. Not only a great book, but such a fun topic. All right. So back at MIT, have you always wanted to write a book about junk food? Like back at MIT, you're sitting in chemistry class and you're saying, someday I will write a book about all the things that are fun, but might be bad for us, but might not.
So I was sitting in Orgo one day, organic chemistry class one day, and the professor, for what reasons I have no clue what they are, asked the entire, and this is like a 300-person lecture, asked the entire class, does anyone know what isoamyl acetate is? And I did not know what isoamyl acetate was. But for some reason, like deep within the depths of my lizard brain, I thought banana. I thought banana. And so I yelled out banana in the middle of a 300-person lecture. And to my shock, he goes, that's right. So I guess it must have been like embedded in my brain at birth that I had to write this book. I've heard it said that, you know, I've heard some advice that says like, don't write a book unless you have a topic that is bursting to get out of you and you have no other choice but to write it. And I think that is true. That is a great motivation for writing a book. But another great motivation is fear of being in breach of contract with your publisher. That's a fantastic motivation to write a book.
How did you even come up with this idea? So, okay, banana, MIT, whatever, but this is not about bananas.
No. So the idea for this really came out of a show that I did for National Geographic about 5 years ago. And the point of the show was, can I make consumer products, stuff that we all have around the house, lipstick, hair conditioner, hand sanitizer, can I make those things out of all natural ingredients? And my original plan was, I am going to go into the forest and pick out a bunch of plants and like take it into my kitchen and then make, hand sanitizer. It turns out it's a lot harder to make things from nature than you would think. And so I ended up ordering a bunch of stuff off Amazon and doing it that way. And even though I did end up ordering things, and that's not going out into a forest and getting things from nature, it still turned out to be hard. You can make a decent lipstick out of like 5 or 6 ingredients, a few different oils, and rust for color.
Right.
But yeah, rust, yeah, like iron oxide. And they actually, Amazon sells little things of rust that they've cleaned. It's not like you're going to get a tetanus infection for this, but but you can't. Most of the stuff that I tried to make was an utter failure. So I was left with the question of, okay, I'm trying to make this natural stuff. It's hard, but is it worth it? Is natural stuff better for you? And the opposite question of that, or the same question asked in a different way, is processed food bad for you? And we all think we know the answer. Yes, very bad. But I really wanted to like dig into why it was bad. So that's the book I thought I was going to be writing. I thought I was going to be writing a book about why processed food is bad for you chemically, what it does when it gets inside your body, and why that's bad.
But that's not the book that you wrote.
How
would you describe it? It's not a diet book.
No.
Not a diet book, not a cookbook. Okay, but how would you describe it then? What did you write?
So I ended up, so once you ask this question of like, is processed food good or bad for you, and why or why not, you first have to actually define processed food, which sounds really boring because we all think we know what it is, but turned out to be one of the most interesting parts of the book. First of all, there's a huge debate in the scientific community about, defining what a processed food is. But even before you get there, through the research I did, I found that we humanity as a species, has been processing food for millennia. I mean, before so long that we don't actually have accurate dates of how long we've been processing food.
Processing food. Processing.
Processing food, yes. And I will give you an example. So there's a group of people called the Aymara who live and have lived for time immemorial in what is now Peru in the Andes, and it's a tough life where they live, and part of the reason it's a tough life is that not a lot grows there. One of the things that does grow there is potatoes, but these are not your grocery store potatoes. These are small, wild, and toxic potatoes. Toxic in the sense that, like, not they're gonna kill you, but they will make you vomit, give you diarrhea, basically like make you never want to eat another potato as long as you live. And you can't just boil them, and like that won't destroy the toxins. They're not environmental contaminants. The toxins are made by the potatoes themselves. Now, why would a potato or any other plant make a poison? Basically to protect itself. The potato is the plant's energy storage thingy, and it doesn't want humans or any other animals digging up its energy stores and eating them. So it's going to make them toxic and protect itself.
We're stealing the potato plant's batteries.
Exactly, yes. We are stealing the potato plant's batteries. And you know, just like you don't want to eat a Duracell, right? Like you have to, we have to do something to those toxic batteries before we eat them. So the Aymara came up with this incredibly ingenious way to both freeze dry and detoxify the potatoes at the same time. And so what they ended up with was perfectly safe to eat, detoxified potatoes that could sit in storage for upwards of 20 years. And they didn't taste good, but like, it doesn't really matter what it tastes like as long as you know you've got food for the winter. So the lengths to which, you know, ancient societies would go, and they're not unique. There's all kinds of other societies who are inventing their own incredibly ingenious processing techniques. And the lengths to which we would go to do that, it was really cool to me.
Okay, so processing, not new and not clearly defined.
Right. Okay.
So can I ask a question about that?
Please.
So I bought some Cheetos in honor of all of this.
Yes.
And so.
Are those the flaming hot Cheetos?
They're flaming hot.
Yes, okay, good.
So first, all right, I have a question about Cheetos, believe it or not. But first, the most important question, flaming hot, crunchy, or classic puffs?
I mean, I think it's a real toss-up between flaming hot and classic. Classic puffs for me, the puffs for me don't rate. I think if I'm feeling a bit spicy, it's flaming hot all the way. And today I'm feeling a bit spicy, so yeah.
Oh, very nice. Okay, well, here you go. All right, so this is my question. Look at this thing. So this does not resemble anything that comes out of the ground or off of a tree, right? Okay, but it's delicious.
Yes.
So explain this to me. How do they change some sort of food? I mean, is it all just created in the laboratory? What do they do? Explain.
So Cheetos are a great example of modern day ingenuity. So what they do is basically, you start with, most of a Cheeto is cornmeal, which is made from corn. And cornmeal, if you've ever had it just by itself, is really bland and doesn't resemble, it's not crunchy, it doesn't resemble a Cheeto at all. So what they'll do is they will take the cornmeal and basically combine it with flavorings, and I actually emailed Cheetos and said, hey, can you please tell me what your flavoring ingredients are? And they wrote me back with a very polite no. But they'll mix the flavorings in with the cornmeal, and then they will pass it through, here's the ingenious part, what's called an extruder. If you picture a wine corkscrew a wine corkscrew, and then you picture all the negative space around a wine corkscrew, if that were also solid. So you would have like a cylinder with a corkscrew shape bored out into it, and then you'd have an actual corkscrew. They basically have a long tube that's like that, and they feed the cornmeal into this thing, which spins continuously.
Okay.
And the cornmeal makes its way through the corkscrew all the way to the very end. And as you can imagine, it's winding its way between the corkscrew and the other part of the negative part of the corkscrew. And during that process, it's creating, there's a lot of friction and a lot of heat because it's spinning really fast. And so what that does is it boils the residual water in the Cheeto slurry. And so by the time and the water doesn't have a ton of places to go because you're in a constrained environment in this corkscrew. So it puffs up the cornmeal. And so by the time it comes out the other end of the extruder, you've got these like very puffy, crispy, or well, sort of half crispy snacks. And then they deep fry it. So everything is better deep fried, even extruded cornmeal snacks. And the extruder is used in all kinds of other stuff. It's like a classic food processing technique that is fairly recent. This is not something that, the Aymara were doing in Peru 2,000 years ago.
And so this is highly processed. I mean, you would call this highly processed, right? There's no question about that. Just because we're heating it up and we're doing the corkscrew type of thing. Okay, and you included in your book, I did not try it, but you included a recipe for homemade DIY Cheetos.
Yes. And I got this recipe. I did not invent this recipe. I was chatting with Ken Albala, who's a professor of food history. And the day after I chatted with him, we were talking through like, well, what does it mean to actually be processed, for food to be processed? And he said, I made some Cheetos in my kitchen yesterday. And I said, what do you mean you made Cheetos? And he said, yeah, I basically took some noodles, dehydrated them, sprayed them with oil, and put them in the microwave. And that kind of recreated this basically deep frying and puffing up the water in the noodle at the same time. And then he said, I sprinkled them with sriracha powder, and then I had homemade Cheetos. And it was an interesting point, because what he was saying was, does my doing that still count as making these foods processed? Like,
right.
Is the Cheeto version that I made at home, does that count as processed food? Or does it only if it comes in a bag and was made in a factory that it's processed food? So it was an interesting question.
What do you say? Processed, yes or no?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think, so my training's in chemistry. I have a chemistry background. I would say, and anybody else would probably say no, but to me, the Cheeto made in a factory and the Cheeto that you make at home, as long as you're using roughly the same ingredients and more or less the same process, I think they're basically roughly the same in terms of processing. The factory is just a much more gigantic version of your kitchen. Now, if the ingredients are really different, if there's things that are added to the Cheetos that are made in a factory that you would never use at home, then we could be talking about, different levels of quote unquote processing. But
all right. So I'm glad you say that, because there are so many chemicals, right? Like if I were to do this at home with cornmeal in sriracha sauce, there is ferrous sulfate, right?
Yeah.
There is monosodium glutamate.
Good old MSG, yeah.
Right. So this all must be bad for you, right? Like this is what I think of. Processed foods. They say, okay, just find something that only has 2 ingredients, and this has many ingredients.
Yes. So this is an interesting one. You'll get people on both sides of this debate, right? Especially folks who are trying to sell you natural, organic, quote unquote, healthier foods will say things like exactly like what you just said, like, make sure you can pronounce the ingredients. Make sure that, there aren't that many of them on the label. if it's something your grandmother wouldn't recognize as food, don't eat it, that kind of thing. And I have a little bit of a skeptical view of that kind of thing. One of the things I did in the book is I was like, okay, let me just invent a food processing scale. And the way I'm going to do this is to count the number of ingredients in everything, and then count the number of syllables in every single ingredient, and just add those two numbers up. If you do that for Skittles, you get like 109, I think, or something like that, right? Okay. And then I thought, okay, well, what if you do that for coffee or an apple or lettuce or anything that you'd consider to be really natural? And I was like, well, coffee, 2 syllables, so is the answer 2. And then I was like, well, there's lots of stuff in coffee. There just doesn't have an ingredients label. There's all kinds of aromatic acids and different compounds. And so I looked up like, okay, well, how many different chemicals are there in a cup of coffee? And it looks like pushing 1,000, like different chemicals.
In coffee?
In coffee, yes. And that's only the ones that we've actually been able to recognize and isolate and determine what they are. If you think about it, coffee is a living thing. It's a cell. It has DNA. It has proteins. It has a cell wall. It has all kinds of stuff in there that is chemically very complex. And then you start roasting it and pouring boiling water on it. You're going to add a whole layer of chemical complexity to it. So if I did my made up processed food sort of scale on coffee, you might get a number like 5,000 if you add up all the syllables of everything in there. So that's when I kind of came down on the side of like, okay, look, like, yes, it can be intimidating to read these ingredients labels, and yes, it does seem overwhelming. But if I think about the true ingredients of what are in all the stuff that's considered natural, that would be off the charts. So that's when I was like, okay, I'm not gonna like view it as this framework of, if I can't pronounce it, then it must be bad for you. There must be something else that will tell you about the health of these things.
Okay, all right. So not chemicals. You're saying number of chemicals or readability of the ingredients list does not necessarily correlate with being bad for us or being healthy. Okay. Yeah. Or the sorts of mechanical or artificial things that we're doing to it, right? Because these Peruvians that are doing the fancy potato thing, right? Is that really that much different than shooting a bunch of cornmeal through a corkscrew? Okay, all right. So how do you figure out? What do you do then? What do you do? Like, does that mean I can eat Cheetos all day long? Because I would.
I've certainly increased my Cheeto and all processed food consumption since doing the book. That's a good question. I mean, I think, figuring out like, is something, how healthy or unhealthy is something for you is a really hard thing to do. And I think most people, certainly I, when I first started this, did not realize how difficult it is to do this. If you really want to get an accurate picture of how good or bad something is for you, ideally, in an ideal world, you would take a large group of people, you would split them up into 2 groups, you would banish each group to their own desert island, you would feed one group the thing that you think is good or bad, and then you would make sure that the other group doesn't have any of that same thing. Okay. And then you would follow them for like 30 years to see, does one group have more heart disease, cancer, diabetes, etc.?
No big deal.
Yeah. Obviously, that is not doable, right? That's not something we're going to spend taxpayer dollars on, and it's highly unethical.
A little bit.
So you have to resort to other measures that are debatable. And these other measures basically are, okay, if you can't banish people to desert islands and force them to eat specific diet, if you're only allowed to just track what people are eating normally and then correlate or associate long-term consumption of a particular food with a bad health outcome, then you start getting into what I learned were murkier waters in terms of really being able to pin a bad health effect or a good health effect on a particular food. And there's the last third of the book is really where I delve deeply into that, more deeply than I ever thought I was going to. But yeah, it bottom line is it can be tricky, and it makes me, so whenever you read a headline on the news about like, eggs linked to 27% increase in heart disease risk, I read those headlines and I go, well, maybe, but also maybe not.
Okay, I'm going to follow up later with questions about that. But getting back to the book, one thing that really struck me is how funny it was. And it was. And I did not expect to be like laughing out loud when you're teaching me chemistry. I hated chemistry in college. That was not my thing. And here I was like laughing about it. So I'm a little curious, did you have to work hard to make all of this chemistry and all this like scientific blah, blah, blah funny? Or did you have to work hard? Was it what?
Yeah. It's funny. There was someone once told me, if you stop trying to be funny, you'll be a lot funnier. which was a funny thing to say, ironically.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff in the book, like, just is objectively funny and doesn't need my help. Like, one of the processing techniques that was used in olden days and might still be used today is there's a Native American group of Native American peoples in or what is now Northern California, who very ingeniously would make candy out of the poop of an insect called an aphid. And aphids are these days agricultural pests, but
little guys, right?
Little guys, yeah, super, super small. You would hardly notice them if you weren't really looking for them.
You can gather their poop.
You can gather their poop, not fresh. It has to dry on the plants first. But then once it does dry, and by the way, what they're eating is plant sap, and plant sap is very sweet. And so what they're pooping is also very sweet. And so you can gather their poop and make it into candy. And like, that kind of thing is both ingenious and also funny, and it doesn't need my help to make it any funnier. But there were some parts where, I'd throw in a joke, and then I'd have my partner Julia read it. And then if she like half chuckled, I'd be like, okay, that's good. And if she rolled her eyes, I'd be like, okay, I'm cutting this joke from the book.
The Julia index. Did your editor ever come back and say, George, no?
Yes, actually, the book had a lot of 4-letter words in it my first draft, and he cut 99% of those.
Oh, okay, all right. So 4-letter words are not. They can be funny. Okay, that was in the purpose of humor, not.
Sometimes humor, and then also sometimes just to be like, oh my God, this is effing incredible. Like, sometimes in the service of that too.
Yes, for effect. Okay, you also illustrated your own book,
yeah.
And I have to say that was kind of brave. I don't think that you're gonna quit your day job and become an illustrator. Okay, did you consider farming it out? What was the thought process there?
Yes, I did consider farming it out, and so actually the show on the National Geographic show, that was illustrated by someone who was super talented. And my first thought was, I'm going to just have Brett do the illustrations for the book. And then, every time you do an illustration, you have to vet it for accuracy, and you have to make sure that, it's right and it fits well with the narrative. And I think there are something like 50 some or so odd illustrations in the book, and that was going to be a lot. And I would sketch out versions of them just so that I could see them in the flow of the manuscript. And I am a terrible artist. And
I
but
won't argue.
yeah, yeah. But it ended up just working because the style of the book is very informal, and the style of the illustrations are also very informal. And I'm not getting paid any money from Apple for saying this, but I actually did most of the illustrations in Keynote, which is their PowerPoint alternative.
Very nice. Okay. It did have a bit of a homegrown kind of look to it.
That's a very kind way of saying they were terrible, but thanks, Regina. Yes.
Mabel was my favorite.
Yeah.
Mabel was, I think, the little insect that we were talking about. Yeah. Okay. Right. I love that you gave her a name.
Thank you.
That was just charming. Okay. Well, what was your book writing process then? Highly regimented, sit down, work for 8 hours a day, words come pouring forth.
Yes, I sat down on a Monday and then wrote continuously until that Friday, and my editor didn't change a single word. Everything was pure gold, start to finish. Oh man, no, I think there's not one single thing in the book that survived from my first draft. In terms of the process, that was quite regimented, and I think Stephen King has good advice on this. He basically says, I sit down at my computer and I don't stop until I have X number of words, whatever my goal is for the day. And your goal can start low and progress as you become more practiced. And it doesn't matter how good or bad the words are. You're going to have days where everything you write is terrible. And you're going to have days where you way overshoot your goal and it's pretty good. But I think the key is consistency. So I would get up at 5:30 or 6 and write for a couple hours in the morning before going to my day job. And I would write for a couple hours in the evening. And then weekends, I would write 8 hours a day, both days on the weekends. And that got to be, as you can imagine, kind of crazy. That
explains a lot, actually. That explains a lot about, I think, the style of the book.
Yeah.
Feverish, yeah.
Yeah, feverish, exactly, yes. Because I was working on deadline and desperately trying to get it out on time. And then my employer finally was like, you can actually take some time off and focus on this if you want, and your job will still be here when you get back, which was very generous. So I did take a 6-month sabbatical to finish up the book. And during that period, it was like a 10-hour days, but only Monday through Friday. It is important to give yourself that time off and stop, recharge, do other things, relax, so that was helpful.
Soundtrack? You listen to music? What? You get dressed? Yeah.
Yes. Actually, Porter Robinson has some great writing out. I mean, it's very like electronic dance type style. And also Rat-a-Tat has some great writing music. It's not something like now I listen to it and I associate it with work. So I don't ever listen to it when I'm not writing or working in some way. But basically things without lyrics or with subtle lyrics that. Do
you have a Spotify playlist? Do you have a?
I can make it public, but yeah, I do have. I'll make it public. That's a good idea. Yeah.
We can put in the comments on this because this sounds kind of fascinating. So when you read it now, you get excited about it, or do you not even read it now?
I have two reactions. One is like, I cannot believe that I actually wrote a book. That's my main reaction. And by the way, I should really shout out. I interviewed a lot of people for this book, you being one of them. There are probably some errors in here. You all try to like make things as factually accurate as possible, but there would be 100 times as many errors without the 80 or so people who I interviewed and sent excerpts of the book to read and make sure that yes, the science is actually represented well. So that was a huge help. So officially, Regina, thank you.
My pleasure.
But now I completely forgot your question. What did you ask?
Like when you read it, do you laugh? No?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm one of those people who reads it and I'm like, oh, I should have written this differently, or I should have changed this sentence, or I should have, and it was my editor who said, he actually sat me down, not physically, but over email, he said, George, I know when writers are tweaking things to the point of like, past that, he was basically like, you're ready to give birth to your book now. It's been the right amount of time. Like, I think it's ready. Stop tweaking it. Just, it's time. And I think that's a really important thing if because you could be writing the same one book your entire life and tweaking it until it was perfect. Every single word was exactly right. But at some point you have to put it out into the world and see what happens.
80, how many scientists? 80, you
80.
say?
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
I was impressed how well you got the statistics part, right? Which is what you and I talked about. So there was a lot of attention to detail. It must be a little terrifying to put a book about science out there. What if there are errors?
Yeah, and this is something I had thought a lot about. I mean, I think there's two types of error. There's a 1 + 1 = 3 error, and there's a 1 + 1 = tomatoes error. So the 1 + 1 = 3 error is your like garden variety typo. You say that something is 6 millimeters when you mean it's 6 nanometers. And, is that wrong? Yes. Is it a huge deal in like the history of science? No. Then there are other errors where if you make them, you could risk giving someone the wrong impression about something in a way that would make them change their behavior.
Right.
There, I think, that's a much more serious error. So, for example, if you only focus on one perspective and don't take a moment to think like, wait a second, what if this could be wrong? Let me talk to some people on the other side of the fence of this and see what they think. If you don't do that, I think you risk your book being very, very one-sided and like painting too rosy of a picture or too negative of a picture. And there you could, there I think it's much more dangerous, even though those aren't really like, they're not so much errors in a clear, unequivocal, this is wrong type way. But yeah, so I was really careful to try and not just go with the first thing I heard, but always investigate the other side.
So you and I talked about statistics, which was kind of a little uncontroversial, but I got the feeling from the book, 80 scientists, that there were a couple of different camps.
Yes.
Of, so people with strong opinions, and okay, tell me about that. What was that like? Do you worry about that?
Yeah. So this gets back to the how do you figure out if something is good or bad for you question, right? There is a group of people, which I'll call the traditionalists, who have been practicing something called nutritional epidemiology for roughly 5 decades or so. And basically what they do is they mail surveys out to a group of people and they ask them, what did you eat this year? And they take those answers and correlate consumption of specific foods with usually negative health outcomes. And that generates headlines like eggs are linked to 27% increase in heart disease risk. That's one camp. The other camp are, I guess what I'll call the skeptics or the methodologists. And that group of people has fundamental issues with the underlying science of the traditionalist camp. And when I was going into this, I had no idea that there were 2 camps. I didn't, I just started down the road and then I think I discovered this actually by reading a rebuttal in a scientific journal that someone else had written. And I was like, oh my God, there's actually a debate here. So it was interesting. And, the different camps may not talk to you in the same the traditionalists don't really have a vested interest in like talking to journalists. The people who want to, the methodologists have a much more, you know, they want to say, hey, listen to me, like I think all of that stuff over there is wrong. So they have a much more vested interest in talking. So you had to really like, I really had to work hard at getting an interview with some folks in the traditionalist camp. But it was, you know, these were fundamental disagreements that I think were also emotional, and not just like, oh, we disagree on the science, but, you know, when the day's done, we're going to both go have a beer at a bar. Like, no, like people got really vehement in their disagreements, and some people called each other names, which I can't repeat here. I mean, I can repeat some of them, but like steaming dog turd was used. Outrageous buffoon was used. I mean, like take off my white glove and smack you in the face level of insults were hurled back and forth.
So people are getting this emotional,
Yeah.
and about basically junk food. How bad is it for you? Or, you know, apples or potatoes or coffee or all of that. Okay, that makes the whole thing a lot more interesting, knowing that there's this big war behind what's going on.
Yes, the Nutritional Epidemiology War. At least I called it that. I don't know. No one's dying. No one's dying. But
so, how did this change your view about science? And so, I think about science a lot lately because we're in week 7 of the lockdown here in DC from the pandemic.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you finished the book before the pandemic hit, but I was struck on reading it, how many kind of eerie parallels there are. And I think you said something once about finding uncertainty actually comforting.
Yeah.
So I could use a little comfort with uncertainty right now. And do you feel like what you learned from researching and writing this book and going through all of this changed how you approach the pandemic?
Totally. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I wrapped up the book, I mean, months before any of this. And I'm actually adding an appendix for the UK edition about hand sanitizer. But other than that, you know, nothing in the book is directly related to coronavirus or infectious diseases or anything like that. But there, you know, I in order to answer the question of is processed food bad for you, I had to answer the question of, well, how do we know anything is true in science? And if you're only reading the news, you might think that science doesn't know what the hell it's doing, because you're reading headlines that change every 6 months. It's like, first coffee's good for you, then it's bad for you, then it's good for you, then it's bad for you, then it doesn't matter, you know, one way or the other. And, you know, we've been through this with trans fats and coffee and eggs and
alcohol.
Alcohol, yes. So you might get the impression that, like, well, you know, can't these scientists figure out whether something is good or bad? Why is this so complicated? And what I learned basically was that, you know, this process is science doing its job. You've got people who run experiments, do them slightly differently, disagree, argue with each other in the literature. And throughout that process, it's not something that takes a few months here and there, this takes years and sometimes decades. Eventually you reach a consensus view. And that happened, for example, with smoking. You know, we started out in the 1930s and before that, basically not knowing that smoking was bad for us. And we ended up in 1964 with the government saying, yeah, smoking is definitely bad for you.
3 decades, about 30 years.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And the research on smoking didn't stop in 1964. It kept going. Now we have a much better chemical understanding of what happens when you smoke a cigarette, what it does in your body, all that sort of stuff. So we've been building evidence for some things that are related to public health for 100 years. and processed foods and these studies about the health effects of processed foods are relatively new. We certainly have not been doing this for 100 years.
Mhm.
So it's kind of only natural to expect that, at least for now, results are going to be quote unquote conflicting. We're gonna have different ways of doing experiments. People are going to disagree more, but eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later, but like you can't rush these things too much. We will come to a consensus about eggs or coffee or whatever it is that we are putting into our bodies on a daily basis.
Okay, so you're trusting the process of science and just saying, okay, until then, I'm just gonna do the best that I can do. Like, how do you make decisions then about how many Cheetos to eat in a day?
Yeah. Basically, yeah. I mean, I think like the only other thing that I would caution here is, or take into account, is like, some of these foods, I believe, this is a personal belief and I don't really have any evidence to back this up, but really are addictive. Like yesterday I ate an illegal amount of peanut M&Ms. And did I want to eat, I don't know, 75 peanut M&Ms? No. Could I stop myself? No. And part of that is stress. Like, we're all in this global pandemic, we're all locked down. Food is I think for everybody, or for a lot of people, modulating your food intake is a natural response to being like such stressful conditions. For me, it's eating more. For other people, it might be eating less. But part of it is that, some of these foods really are engineered to be, I think, addictive. And so being conscious of that and saying, look, one Cheeto, like a bag of Cheetos every now and again, is not going to kill me, but like I shouldn't make it a habit to the point where I'm ordering a pallet of Cheeto off of Uline. You know what I mean? Like that level of...
What's wrong with that? Don't knock my habits, George.
I was going to say, are you going to turn your camera sideways and reveal a gigantic pallet of Cheetos? Yeah.
Judgy.
Oh, man.
Okay, so, one of the things that I liked coming away from the book, besides just like a lot of random factoids about plants are trying to kill you, that was one of my favorite chapters. Microbes are trying to eat your food, right? Chapter 3, I love that. Was, I don't know, a sense of like, chill, right? Chill out about this. And one of the things that I really liked that helped get me there, well, putting processed food in the whole historical perspective of what we're doing, I feel like that really helped. Like, okay, we just have more mechanics of doing it now, but we've been tinkering with food for a long time.
Yeah.
But the bit where you talked about the death tables, or life tables, I guess is a better way of putting it. So what is, like, give me a factoid. What is, I feel like my chance of dying right now, if I ate Cheetos all the time, would be huge. But you say, having read the life tables, something different.
Yes. So this is another thing. So to answer the central question of this book, I had to dabble in a lot of fields that I am not an expert in. And I relied on you for help with statistics, and I relied on demographers for help with, these kinds of things. So again, thank you for that. But one of the interesting things was, a lot of the things you see is such and such food will increase your risk of death by 14%. And this actually, a study came out relatively recently about processed food that said, if you increase an increase of 10% by weight of processed food is correlated with a 14% increase in risk of death. That's a complicated sentence to parse, but if you want to just focus on the 14% risk of death part for now, like what I wanted to know was, well, what does that mean exactly? What is a 14% risk of death? Does that mean that I take my lifespan, which I expect to be about 80 years, and I, subtract 14% of that? I mean, that would be a huge impact on my life expectancy.
Right.
And actually, this gets back to like how many people I interviewed. I think I interviewed something like 12 people on this one thing, because people kept saying like, no, you're wrong. No, this is wrong. No, this is, and I kept going to, an expert who was more, deeply ingrained in the subject until I finally got an answer. But
you did your homework.
Yeah, I did. Because it was so frustrating. I would literally have scientists email me telling me that the other scientist was wrong. And I was just like, well, what am I supposed to believe? So this 14% can be really scary. And in order to figure out, well, it turns out you're not just multiplying your life expectancy by a decrease of 14%. That is not the right way to do it. What you actually have to do is look at a table that tells you your risk of dying throughout your life at every given age you are. And it's actually a fascinating table just in and of itself. I learned, for example, that your risk of death in any given year only hits 10% when you turn 87, which
87.
Yeah, I thought, if I turn 50, my risk of death is going to be 10% in any given year. But we've made such incredible strides with medicine and hygiene and public health over the past 500 years that we really have reduced our risk of death a lot, especially in the early phases of life. Early, mid, and the early part of the late phase of life, right? So, what you have to do, so the way to take this 14%, increase in risk of death that's associated with processed food and translate into some number that we can all understand, which is, how does this impact your life expectancy? You have to basically sprinkle it on a life table and see what happens. And when you do that, it turns out that you're looking at a roughly 1 year reduction in life expectancy, which is counterintuitive. You think 14%, oh my God, that's a lot. But it turns out, 1 year is less. Now I did talk to a demographer about this, and I ran this by her, and she said, well, listen, a year for you might seem like not that long because you're 34, but a year for my 75-year-old dad, like, that's a long time, especially if you've got grandchildren who, they want to see a lot over the next year. So it also brought, it did bring home that point of, like, life expectancy changes can be different depending on where you are in life.
I would argue that some processed food is just so delicious that there's a quality of life issue. Maybe I have an extra year, but am I enjoying that extra year? Would I have enjoyed, lots of peanut M&Ms for the past 70 years? Perhaps instead, I'm just going to put that out there as a conjecture.
Yes, no, I totally agree. I mean, there is, and quality of life is not something that I got into super in depth in the book, but it's totally important. I think the quote I heard on that was, "We're here for a good time, not a long time."
Oh, nice, so nice. Well, I came away from it, feeling much more like big things matter, but the little decisions that I'm making about eating my bag of Cheetos, I don't feel a huge amount of guilt about that now. As long as I'm balancing it out and doing lots of other healthy things, every tiny little bit, it just feels, when you're like, okay, how can this not be? Look at it, it's fluorescent. So I appreciate that. I feel like coming out of the book, I was reassured. Perhaps this is what you meant when you said uncertainty is reassuring.
Yeah.
Where you're right, I don't have the answers, but it's okay.
Yeah.
Enjoy yourself.
Exactly. Yep.
Is that what you would say?
Yes, and also that, knowing that temporary uncertainty is an early part of the scientific process as well. Like, maybe this stuff will not get figured out in my lifetime. Maybe it will, who knows? But at least I know that it's not just that, scientists are a bumbling bunch of bozos who can't get it right. Like, no, this is supposed to happen. There's supposed to be disagreement. There's supposed to be debates on these things. it's good to have this sort of intellectual back and forth between two camps or more than two camps. All of that I found reassuring too.
I feel like this is in some ways a much more grown-up book than books, than books that claim to have all the answers. Just do this, you're going to live forever, you're going to be healthy, right? We know this for sure, very prescriptive. And this is a very grown-up approach to that, where you're not claiming to have all the answers.
Yeah, and it's funny, they say don't read the reviews of your books, which I can't not read the reviews, but some people have explicitly said, you know, it was disappointing that he doesn't give like clear advice or solid answers. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to invent stuff that I didn't actually find and just tell you that, you know. But it, you know, it was frustrating for me as a researcher too, because I didn't know any of this at the beginning, and I was like, well, what is the answer? But I think we all nowadays, we all don't have a choice. We have to live with a lot of uncertainty. And so if we know that, hopefully if we know that that's okay, and that, you know, that things are, at least in science, happening as they are supposed to, then great.
There you go. I feel like you gave us tools rather than, in perspective, rather than advice.
That would be, yeah, that would be my dream. I mean, my hope for this book is that it's not just something that someone would read, be like, oh, that's interesting, and put it aside. My hope is that it would be well thumbed and like basically a tool that they can use to help evaluate information that comes at them, especially now, every single day.
Right. I like that. So given that I felt so much more comfortable with my junk food intake,
Yes.
I thought for our final question, if you're up for something, what, for people that are going to buy the book and read it for the first time, what would be a good meal pairing, right? Like instead of a wine pairing, like what should you sit down and eat while you're, so Cheetos, definitely maybe an appetizer of Cheetos.
Yeah.
What else?
So I think you want to start salty and work your way to the sweet. I think Cheetos is a great place to start.
Appetizer.
I would start with flaming hot, because, you know, you just start strong, right? Then maybe work your way over to some chips. I like the kettle cooked variety. That's kind of a palate cleanser. I'd follow that up with, let's see here. Goldfish. Goldfish is really like the main course for me here.
Oh, wait a minute. I'm thinking main course. Okay, I'm going to put it out there. Circus peanuts.
Oh, you mean the kind that you have to like undo yourself?
Yeah, or something. The things that are wholly unnatural. Right?
Oh,
Orange, you know? No, not real peanuts. Circus peanuts.
gotcha. Yeah.
Candy corn. I feel like maybe a hot dog kind of version of the circus peanuts. Okay.
And speaking of hot dogs, I mean, that's a great processed food right there, right? Like you could have 2 chili dogs, and then, you know, polish it off with some Starburst, maybe some Skittles if you're into that, and then finish it off with a few peanut M&Ms.
But not 76 of them.
Not 76 of them. Yeah, everything in moderation.
All right. I feel like when you put up your Spotify playlist, then maybe you should have a little bit of food pairings to go on.
Yes, like a menu for the book.
All right. George, this has been so much fun. I love your book. I hope everyone goes out to get it right away. And maybe while they're online, they order some Starburst and peanut M&Ms along with it.
Thank you.
Enjoy it to the heart's content.
This has been great. Thank you for having me.
There's Phil.
I declare these sprouts to be delicious. George, I've got a question for you. How much is an illegal amount of M&Ms, peanut M&Ms? Exactly. Please.
Well, I bought the largest possible size available at Costco, which is 3 pounds and 14 ounces. And I think I reasonably ate like a good 14 ounces of that. And I did feel sick after doing that. So disclaimer, would not recommend trying that at home.
I bet it was delicious in the moment.
Yeah.
George and Regina, this was just a ton of fun and super educational. I cannot thank you both enough for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Sure. And I'd like to thank all of you for being with us for this Saturday night premiere. I'm certain that you'd enjoy picking up your own copy of Ingredients, the Strange Chemistry of What We Put in Us and On Us, which you can do right now by visiting our partner, independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. Just click on the link that we have in the description box below to order your copy. In conclusion, we've got 4 fantastic author presentations coming up next weekend as we close out our 2020 featured programming. Be sure to join us Friday evening at 5:30 p.m. for a live discussion with best-selling authors Meg Waite-Clayton, author of The Last Train to London, and Alex George, author of The Paris Hours. On Saturday night at 7, we're featuring an interview with Washington Post syndicated columnist E.J. Dionne, author of Code Red, How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. Then, on Sunday morning, kids and kids of all ages can tune in at 11 a.m. for a fun presentation by Juana Medina, author of Juana and Lucas, Big Problemas. Finally, parents, at 3 p.m. next Sunday, our VGBF closing program is designed just for you. Join us for an important conversation featuring Maria Russo in her book, How to Raise a Reader, which has been hailed as an indispensable guide to welcoming children to a lifelong love of reading. All presentations will be accessible right here on the GBF YouTube channel. Okay, my friends, that wraps it up for tonight. I've been your VGBF host, Phil Kaminsky. Have a great evening, and as always, keep reading.